Greetings friends from a dead man, and today we riddle out just when the Civil War, the event that saw the rise of the party, the fort police and all the horrors of Oceania's police state happened. Today will be an exercise in determining the time of the conflict, with a later video theorising about what exactly happened during the conflict, which I promise you will be interesting for curious fans. So for those coming into all of this blind, yes, there was a civil war in the backstory of 1984. We know the party came to power through an anti-capitalist revolution, but it can be difficult to gauge exactly when via a casual reading of the novel. Winston's recollections and the lore don't set it all out in a neat timeline or sequence, so this is exactly what I'll do today. A quick word though, that while a specific concrete date is not written in black and white within the text, we certainly can and will narrow the conflict to a decently narrow time period, and we can do this by forging a chronological path using what we do know in the lore. There are certain things we do know. For starters, Winston is reasonably sure that he is 39 years old, giving us a birth date of about 1944 or 45. In universe, we know that the Second World War still happened, and barring any obvious evidence of historical deviation, this panned out the same. Dating the atomic war is actually fairly straightforward, as we have 3 lore points that do this. Going in order, these are Winston's memory of sheltering in the tube station in Part 1, Chapter 3, the church tower meeting scene in Part 2, Chapter 3, and the reference to atomic bombs in Goldstein's book. In the first, Winston rather vaguely dates the memory to around the time the atomic bomb was dropped on Colchester. The second most helpfully dates it to 1954 exactly, as it reads, quote, where an atomic bomb had fallen 30 years earlier. The language is unusually precise, and this also helps us date the memory to when Winston was about 9 or 10 too. Finally, Goldstein's book helpfully corroborates this year with the more open description of the war occurring in the 1950s, but also dates it more precisely too with the line, quote, atomic bombs first appeared as early as the 1940s and were first used on a large scale about 10 years later. Well, since we know the bombs indeed appeared and were used in a limited way in 1945 within Japan, this language brings us comfortably to about 1954 too. Note Orwell helps by writing about, which could be 9 years, so roughly the decade. In the tube station chapter, Winston describes a fairly long interval of peace in his early childhood, which makes sense as the Second World War ended around the time of his birth, and there would indeed have been a pretty long period of peace that lasted to the atomic war. Another key lore date we have to narrow things further is the first 3-year plan, which can be dated to 1958 if we work our way back from the information in Part 1, Chapter 4. 1958 is a definite year of party power then, but on reflection, we can push this back to about 1956. We can do this as we know beyond a reasonable doubt that Winston's parents were amongst the victims of the first purge. I think Winston describes it as one of the earlier ones anyway. How do we know this? Well, the language of the chapter all but confirms this. Quote, when he came back, his mother had disappeared. This was already becoming normal at that time. Nothing was gone from the room except his mother and his sister. They had not taken any clothes, not even his mother's overcoat. To this day, he did not know with any certainty that his mother was dead. It was perfectly possible that she had merely been sent to a forced labour camp. The presence of the labour camp, the manner of his family's disappearance, and the chronology of events too, all suggest the party was in power at this time. Interestingly for us today, we know from the chronology of Winston's recollections that the Civil War occurred before the disappearances of both his mother and sister, as this event is described later in the chapter. Frustratingly, in Part 2, Chapter 7, Winston is not absolutely specific in terms of dates, but, as you'll see momentarily, this doesn't matter. Quote, he was not certain of the date, but he could not have been less than 10 years old. possibly 12 when it had happened. So Winston outright dismisses any age below 10 years old and tops off the range at about 12. Well, given our previous information, we can certainly date it after 10 years old, as this was Winston's age around the time of the Atomic War in 1954. If we go for 12, then that gets us to about 1956 or 7 as the time of his family's purge. Another key bit of language is Winston's hazy memory of when his father was taken. He knows both Mum and Dad were purged. Quote, his father had disappeared some time earlier. How much earlier, he could not remember. So, a bit annoying, but not too bad. If you'll recall, we know Winston's father was present in the tube station scene, and we know this was in 1954. Winston's father then helps us anchor the time period of the purges between 1954 and about 1956. Now we've nailed down things a bit, we can further solidify our timings with some common sense and further lore detail. Firstly, one thing we do know for definite is that the Civil War lasted a few months at least. The quote is, quote, for several months during his childhood, there had been confused street fighting in London itself. By several, this is normally taken to mean a few, but not a lot of something. So more than 3, let's say, but less than 10. So if we're talking about a period of 4 to 9 months, this conflict would have taken up a large portion of a year at least. Well, since we know the Atomic War occurred in 54, though precisely when in the year is unknown, we can reliably give an early part of the range from middle or even later 54. An atomic war could have lasted just days, perhaps weeks. We know hundreds of bombs were dropped. I'm guessing, however, that even if the actual bombings only lasted a very short time, the fallout and chaos would have likely prevented any organised efforts in any civil conflict. The Civil War is finished by the purging of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, so even if we date these from anywhere from mid to late 1956, this narrows things nicely from around later 54 to early 56, a rough 18-month period. Recall, however, that the conflict was several months long, so it couldn't likely be contained entirely in 54 or 56. My thinking then is that the Civil War months are mostly, if not entirely, contained in 1955. This snugly fits these months between the major events of the Atomic War and the party in power. Remember too how Winston is unsure of the time between his father and mother's disappearances too, so we can reasonably add a few weeks to maybe even a couple of months between these, further dividing the periods. From the language describing the change that came over his mother, I suspect we're talking weeks, if not days. Anyhow, this is how I date the Civil War in the novel, using the lore. To summarise, the Second World War ended in 45. A period of peace ensues until the Atomic War, which occurs in 54, around the time Winston was 10. A few months to a year later in 1955, possibly spilling into 54 or 56 either end, the Civil War occurs. Then around the time Winston was 12, so in about 1956, his family are purged. So what do you think? If you're wondering what may have happened specifically in the Civil War itself, stay tuned for part 2 coming soon, which should be surprising for some, as I have some interesting thoughts on this. Until then, remember, nothing is efficient in Oceania except the thought police.